Welcome to this video. My name's Dr. Gunn and I'm your professor for elementary Greek. We're going to continue through Dr. Philemon Zachariou's reading and pronouncing biblical Greek. In this video, we're considering chapter 5 on diacritics and punctuation. Diacritics are small marks written usually above the letters of the alphabet to help with the pronunciation and the interpretation. There are two kinds of diacritics in New Testament Greek. We have both breath marks and accent marks. In this table that you're looking at on this slide, you'll see a list of words, and over the tops of the letters, you'll see a number of these diacritics. Another interesting thing about this table is that the words on the left correspond to the words on the right in that they're spelled exactly the same. The only difference is in the diacritics. And this helps us to realize that the diacritics are important. When the diacritics change, it can change the entire meaning of the word. Take a look at the first pair. The first word on the left is alpha, kappa, rho, alpha, tav, omega, sigma, pronounced akratos. Now notice there's a diacritic over the initial alpha. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's a breath mark. The diacritic over the second alpha in the word is the accent mark. That's the syllable that gets stressed. So it is akratos with a stress on that second syllable. Akratos. Now look at the word corresponding to this over on the right. Spelled exactly the same. Alpha, kappa, rho, alpha, tav, omega, sigma. Also, over the alpha, we have a breath mark, just like we did on the one on the left. But notice that the accent mark has changed. Instead of an accent mark over the alpha, it is now over the omega, and it looks different. Now, disregard the fact that it looks different for a moment. Consider just now that the emphasis shifts from the middle syllable to the last syllable. So whereas the one on the left was pronounced akratos, this one on the right is pronounced akratos, with the emphasis on the last syllable, akratos. So akratos means unmixed. Akratos means uncontrolled. Two different words, and the only difference is in the accent. Notice the other examples. The second, demos, means people. Demos means fat. Third, the aero means lift up. The aro, divide. Next, zito, live long. Zito, I seek. Thea means view. Thea means goddess. Nomos is law. Nomos is pasture or district. Pote means when, but pote means ever. So you can see that the accent is important to learn along with these words. You must learn the accent with each Greek word that you will learn in this class. Diacritics were not used in the original Greek autographs when the New Testament was originally written. People knew how to pronounce these words because they were part of their normal vocabulary, their normal speech, and they knew where the accent was supposed to go. In about the 7th century AD, as most of the people in the Roman Empire were shifting from Greek to Latin, fewer and fewer native Greek speakers existed. And so to help people who were interested in reading the Greek New Testament, The scribes began inserting these accent marks so that people would know where to put the stress on the syllable. In today's printed texts of the Greek New Testament, we have both accent marks and breath marks preserved for us in the text, but they were not part of the original Greek autographs. Now let's talk for a few moments about these breath marks. In addition to accents, Greek has two breath marks. They are the smooth breath mark and the rough or aspirate breath mark. The smooth breath mark, you'll notice, looks like an apostrophe. For that matter, the rough breath mark also looks something like an apostrophe, but the difference between them is that they face opposite directions. They are mirror images of each other. The smooth breath mark is a curved mark, like an apostrophe, with the cup facing towards the left. The rough or aspirate breath mark is also a curved mark, with the cup now facing towards the right. So this is how you can distinguish between them. The breath marks themselves are not pronounced, and in fact they're not used in modern Greek, but they are important for you to recognize because they can determine the meaning of a word. In Greek, every word that begins with either a vowel or with the letter rho takes a breath mark. Breath marks are placed over the initial lowercase vowel or rho that begins in that way. Look, for example, at this word, alpha, gamma, alpha, pi, eta, pronounced ayapi. And over the initial alpha, you have a breath mark. Can you tell which one this is? Is it smooth or is it rough? Well, since it is cupped facing the left, this is a smooth breath mark, ayapi. Of course, ayapi is one of the words that many people know the meaning of. It is the Greek word for love. Look at another example. Imera, spelled eta, mi, epsilon, rho, alpha. Imera. Since this begins with a vowel, the letter eta, it must have a breath mark. Now, which breath mark do we have here? Well, since it is cupped facing to the right, this one is what we call a rough or aspirate breath mark. The third example is spelled omicron, sigma, tau, iota, and then terminal sigma. So this is pronounced ostis, ostis. And over that initial omicron, since this word begins with a vowel, it has a breath mark. And once again, we find, like imera, it takes the rough breath mark. One more example here. Take a look at this word, rho, eta, mi, alpha, pronounced rima, rima. So again, words that begin with either a vowel or with the letter rho take a breath mark. This word has an initial rho. And when a word begins with rho, usually the breath mark is, as it is here, a rough or aspirate breath mark, cupped facing to the right. So these are your breath marks. Now, what if the word begins with a capital letter? You don't have enough room to write the breath mark over the top of it because it's so tall. In this case, the breath mark is placed at the upper left of a capital letter. So here are the same words that we just looked at, as well as a couple of others, that have the breath mark written just before the initial capital letter. So we have first ayapi. Notice the smooth breath mark at the upper left of that first alpha. Next, imera, with the rough breath mark just before that capital eta. Third, ostis, with a rough breath mark at the upper left of the capital Omicron. Next, rima, rough breath mark just before the capital Rho. Then notice the next one, eyo. Eyo, this is the Greek word for I, not E-Y-E, but I like the letter I, myself. And we get the English word ego from this. So eyo, and it's an important Greek word we'll take a look at later on this semester in many of the sayings of Christ in the Gospel of John, where he says, I am. This is the word eyo. But I want you to notice now the smooth breath mark, the upper left corner of this capital epsilon. Right after eyo, you'll notice orthos. Orthos, the Greek word for straight. Our English word orthodoxy comes from this. Orthodoxy is literally straight teaching. Orthos. But notice just for now the capital Omicron at the beginning of this word and the smooth breath mark just before it. Lastly, notice the word rhiza. Rhiza is the Greek word for a root. And plants that grow roots, those roots are referred to as rhizomes, coming from this Greek word. But I want you to notice just before that capital Rho, the rough breathing. So these are breath marks, and all Greek words that begin with either a vowel or the letter Rho will take a breath. Breath marks also will be used when a word begins with a digraph. Now, when you have a digraph consisting of two vowels, the breath mark will be placed over the second letter of the digraph. Notice these examples. First, aftos, beginning with alpha epsilon. Remember from our previous video that alpha epsilon is pronounced av or af. So this word is aftos. But the breath mark is placed not over the alpha, but over the epsilon. Why? Because always a breath mark occurs over the second letter of a digraph. Look at the next example. Evlogo. Evlogo. With the digraph being representing the breath mark over the second letter. Next word, emma. Alpha, iota, mi, alpha. Emma is the Greek word for blood. And the digraph has its breath mark written over the second letter, that is the iota. Here it is a rough breath mark. The other example we're looking at here, the last one, is the word ios, epsilon, iota, omicron, sigma, the Greek word for sun. Not the sun in the sky, but the sun who is your child, S-O-N, that kind of a sun. And very, very common word in Greek in the New Testament, ios. Here we find the rough or aspirate breath mark written over the second member of the digraph, epsilon iota. Okay, so these are the breath marks. I want to move on to another kind of diacritic, and this is where it begins to get just a little bit complicated, but you can master this subject in time. You'll observe these accents, we'll talk about them, and I will present some general rules about accents in this video that will help you to understand what kind of accent is used, when it's used, and where it is to be used. Basically, printed biblical Greek is referred to as polytonic, meaning that it uses multiple kinds of accent marks. This was ancient Greek, and how ancient Greek was represented once the accent marks began to be printed. Now, modern Greek is called monotonic because it only uses one accent mark. So we are looking at something a little bit different in our printed texts of the Greek New Testament than you will find in modern Greek. But we do have three different accents that are used. The Greek word for an accent is a tonos, or in the plural, toni, toni. The three accents we find in printed Biblical Greek are as follows. Number one, the acute accent. Notice the little mark to the right of the word acute. It is a rising line, rising from left to right, straight line called the acute accent. A second accent is called the grave accent. For the grave accent, you simply take the acute accent and you turn it around. It points down from left to right and is a straight line. The third accent is called circumflex. Now, depending on which printed text you're looking at, it may look either like a Spanish tilde, like that S laying on its side, or it might look like a little cupped hat, like a yarmulke or a kippah that the Jews wear on their heads. So the circumflex can look either way. And these are the three accents that you'll find in Greek, and there are various rules as to which one will be used and where it can be placed on any given word. The accent in Greek marks the syllable that is stressed in pronunciation. So take a look at this example. The word alpha, yama, yama, epsilon, lambda, omicron, sigma. So the alpha is an A sound, A. Remember from a previous video, a double gamma is pronounced like NG. Epsilon is a short E sound, lambda is an L, omicron is an O sound, and your terminal sigma will sound like S. So this is pronounced angelos, angelos. Can you hear that there are three syllables? There's ang, then there's gel, and then there's os, angelos. When this word is pronounced, it is the first of those three syllables that gets pronounced. And you'll notice that it is over the alpha in the first syllable that has both the breath mark, because you have an initial vowel, but also an accent. And this accent happens to be the acute accent. You'll notice that it rises from left to right. So this word is pronounced angelos. It is not pronounced angelos, nor is it pronounced angelos. The accent or the emphasis should be on that first syllable, angelos. Now there's no difference in the way the acute, circumflex, or grave accent is pronounced. They do the same thing. They mark the syllable that is stressed in pronunciation. But it is important that you know which accent mark is used, whether it is acute, grave, or circumflex. And we'll talk about those in just a moment. Now, some Greek words, as we saw in a previous slide in this video, are distinguished from each other only by accent. Otherwise, they're spelled exactly the same. So the accent is very important for you to notice. Now, what about where the accent falls? Here's one thing helpful to know. Even though some Greek words are very long, having many, many syllables, Greek words may only be accented on one of the last three syllables. If a Greek word, for instance, were 4 syllables long, it could not be accented on the first syllable. If it were 5 syllables long, it could not be accented on either the first or the second syllable. A Greek word can only be accented on one of the last 3 syllables. And usually a Greek word will have only one accent. Now there are some exceptions to this, and occasionally you'll find a Greek word with 2 accent marks on it. We'll talk about that later when we come to it. But for now, just consider the last three syllables as syllables that can have an accent, and most words will have only one accent. Now let's talk about these last three syllables. They have names. The last syllable, going from right to left now, reading backwards, if you go to the very last syllable of a word, is called the ultima. Think of our word ultimate. The ultimate is the end, and the end syllable is the ultima, the end, the last syllable. Move back one, that is the second to the last syllable, it's called the penult. Penult. Well, pe in Latin means before. So the penult is that which becomes before the ult or the ultima. So the penult, the one just before the ultimate, it's the second to the last syllable. And then just before the penult, that is counting back 1, 2, 3 syllables back into the word, third from the end, is called the antepenult. And this word is appropriate because ante, A-N-T-E, means before. P-E means before, so the antepenult is the one that comes before the one that's before the ultima. So that's a long way of explaining the names of these last three syllables, but we'll be using these names. Again, ultima is the last syllable, penult, the second to the last, antepenult, third from the last. These are the three syllables that may be accented in a Greek word. Let's illustrate this by looking at an example. Here we have the Greek word anthropos, spelled alpha, ni, theta, rho, omega, omicron, sigma, pronounced anthropos, anthropos. And I've just noticed I have a typographical error in anthropos at the very top of this slide. My apologies for that. It is spelled correctly underneath in the larger print, anthropos. There is a smooth breathing over the initial alpha and an acute accent there. There are three syllables to the word anthropos, the Greek word for man. By the way, in English, we get the word anthropology from this Greek word. Anthropology is the study of man. Three syllables, an, thro, and pos. So when we talk about these three syllables, I want you to notice that the last syllable is the ultima. So the ultima for anthropos is the syllable pos. Moving back from there one syllable, we have the second to the last syllable, thro. This is what we call the penult. And then moving back one more syllable into the word, we have the first syllable, or the third from the end, the syllable an, and this is the antepenult. So when talking about accent in relation to the word anthropos, we would say that it has an acute accent on the antepenult. You see the acute accent right after the smooth breathing mark on the initial alpha. And this is the antepenult. So acute accent on the antepenult. Now take a look at the fourth point here on this slide. The last three syllables are the ultima, penult, and antepenult. That's what we just saw in the word anthropos. Point number 5 is very important. This is a repeat from the previous video that we had in this series about the vowels, but here's where this information becomes very, very important. When we talk about vowels in relation to accents, we have both long vowels and short vowels. Notice point number 5, eta and omega are considered to be long vowels for the purposes of accent. Epsilon and omicron are considered to be short vowels for the purposes of accent. The other three vowels, alpha, iota, and epsilon, can be either long or short, and you will learn that when you look at the actual words and see where and how they are accented. Now, digraphs almost always are considered long. Two exceptions are for alpha iota and omicron iota when these digraphs occur at the end of a word. Now, if they're beginning of the word or within a word somewhere, they are considered long, like all other digraphs. But when alpha iota and omicron iota occur at the end of a word, they are considered to be short. Also, vowels with iota subscript, another kind of digraph, are always considered to be long. So the basic rule, digraphs are long, with only those two exceptions that we noted. Now let's talk about the rules for accent. There are some general accentuation rules, and then we'll talk about specifics that are related to those final three syllables. But the general accentuation rules are as follows. First of all, an acute accent may stand on any of the last three syllables. The acute accent, that straight line rising from left to right, is sort of the most general purpose accent mark. And that, in fact, is pretty much the accent mark that is used in modern monotonic Greek. They have conserved that acute accent. But it is the most versatile of the three accents. The other two accents are more limited in their use. And so, number two, the circumflex accent may only stand on either the ultima or the penult. So remember again, the ultima is the last syllable. The penult would be the second to the last syllable. A circumflex will never stand on the antepenult. Circumflex accent, the one that looks like a tilde or like a little cupped hat, will only stand on the ultima or the penult. And then the third general rule is the grave accent. The grave is the most limited of these three accents, and it may only stand on the ultima. You will never find a grave on the penult or the antepenult. Now, let's consider more strictly the accented antepenult, third from the end. This is the furthest back in the word that we are finding an accent. The antepenult can only be accented if the ultima is short. Also, the accent on the antepenult can only be acute. Remember, the circumflex accent can only be found on the ultima or penult, and the grave only on the ultima. So if there is an accent on the antepenult, it must be an acute accent. And it can only stand there if the ultima is short. Consider these examples. The first one, kappa, epsilon, rho, iota, omicron, sigma, pronounced Kyrios. It's the Greek word for Lord. Kyrios. Notice you have three syllables, ki, ri, and os. Now, the accent is an acute accent on the antepenult. You can see that's the third syllable back in the word. And it is appropriately an acute accent. When the antepenult is accented, it must be acute. And the acute accent can only stand on the antepenult if the ultima is short. Well, let's look at the ultima. Which one is the ultima? The last syllable, os, omicron sigma. Since omicron is one of our short vowels, that makes the ultima a short syllable. And so, yes, it is properly accented with an acute on the antepenult because the ultima is short. Look at the second example, anthropos. We've already looked at this word. This is the word for man, and it has 3 syllables, an, thro, and pos. So pos at the end is the ultima, thro, second from the end, is the penult, an at the beginning of this word, or third from the end, is the antepenult. Notice it is accented properly with an acute accent. And it can take an acute accent because the last syllable, the ultima, is short. Again, it's os, spelled with omicron. Omicron is always short. Hence, this syllable is a short syllable. Anthropos. The third example, the letters P, Ni, Epsilon, Eta, Mi, Alpha, Taf, Omicron, Sigma. I think I said Eta when I meant Epsilon. My error. Now, the P is pronounced like the English letter P. The Ni like the English N. Epsilon, Epsilon is a digraph pronounced ev or f. The Mi is an M sound, Alpha is an A, Taf is a T sound, and then we have our familiar Omicron, Sigma on the end. So this word is pronounced pneumatos. Pneumatos means spirit or wind or breath. Now we have 3 syllables. The ultima is os, the penult is mat, and the antepenult is pnev. Notice it is accented on the antepenult, pnev, with an acute accent, and the acute accent can stand on that syllable because the ultima is short, spelled with an omicron. So here are our short ultimas, our omicron sigmas, allowing that acute accent to stand on the antepenult. That's our rule about an accented antepenult. Now let's talk about an accented penult, the second from the end, the penult. When the penult is accented and the penult is long, if you have a short ultima, the accent will be circumflex. Now remember, this penult could be accented with either an acute or a circumflex. The penult will never be accented with a grave. Grave can only stand on the ultima. But how do you know which accent to put on the penult? Well, the normal rule is this. If the penult is long and the ultima is short, then the penult will take a circumflex accent. Circumflex accents only exist over long vowels. And long vowels like to take circumflex accents as long as the rules for accent allow it. So a long penult that's accented will be circumflex as long as that ultima is short. Here are some examples of this rule. Notice number 1, utos. Utos only has 2 syllables in it. You have an ultima, omicron sigma, and you have a penult, ut, omicron epsilon taf. Here, the ultima is short. That means the circumflex can stand over the long penult. Why is the penult long? Because it consists of a digraph, omicron epsilon, and all digraphs are considered long for accent purposes. So in the word utos, we find the rules for an accented penult allow that circumflex accent. Look at the second example, tuto. Again, there are only 2 syllables here. There's an ultima, the tav omicron on the end, and there's a penult, the tav omicron epsilon in the first syllable, or the second from the end, the penult, tuto. Since the last syllable is short, has omicron, the circumflex accent can stand on that long penult. Same with the third word, ipon. Ipon. The ultima is short because it has omicron. The penult is long since it consists of a digraph, epsilon iota, and so we find the circumflex accent. Ipon. Notice the next example, idon, epsilon iota, delta, omicron, ni, idon. Short ultima, spelled with an omicron. Long penult, consisting of the digraph, epsilon iota. And so we have circumflex accent on the long penult. Last example, either. Either. Now here, I want you to notice something interesting. We have two syllables. We have an ultima consisting of delta, alpha, the, and a penult consisting of a digraph. Now we said earlier that the letter alpha could be sometimes long, sometimes short. By thinking about the rules for accent, can you tell whether this alpha is long or short? The rule says that the circumflex accent can stand on a penult only if the ultima is short. So in this word, the alpha must be a short alpha, not a long alpha. So by knowing this word and knowing the rules, you can tell whether the alpha in the word either is long or short. Okay, so this is one of the rules for an accented penult. In this case, we have a short ultima. But supposing we have a long penult and a long ultima. If you have a long ultima, the accent on the penult will change to an acute accent. So the accented penult will take acute accent if the ultima now is a long one. Look at these examples. Akuo. Now akuo has 3 syllables. The ultima is just the omega, O. The penult is your omicron epsilon, a digraph, and so it's long. And the antepenult is alpha, akuo. We're only concerned here with the ultima and the penult. The penult is long. It could take a circumflex accent. Circumflex accents can stand on long vowels. However, since the ultima is long, the circumflex cannot stand on the penult. And so the accent, rather than being a circumflex, will change to acute. And this is the proper way of accenting the word akuo. By the way, the Greek word akuo means to hear. And in English, the word acoustics comes from this. Did you know that something like 1/3 of English vocabulary is based on Greek roots? And we'll see a great many of these Greek words that are similar in sound to their corresponding English words. Akuo is a good example of that. Look at the second example. Pistevo. Pistevo. 3 syllables long. P, stev, and O. The ultima is the O. Now, is the omega long or short? Well, remember, omega is always considered long for accent purposes. Since it has a long ultima, the accented penult cannot take the circumflex accent. It must take an acute accent. So pistevo is correctly accented here with the acute. Similarly, we have utos, long ultima, acute accent on the penult. Next, alilon, long ultima with omega, acute accent on the penult. Next word, sozo. Sozo, again, omega in the ultima requires the accented penult to have the acute accent. It may not take the circumflex accent with that long ultima. Notice with sozo also, did you spot the iota subscript underneath that first omega? Last word, irini. Irini, the Greek word for peace. The ultima here is spelled with an eta. Eta is always long for accent purposes, and therefore the penult, even though it's long, cannot take the circumflex accent. It must take an acute accent, irini. Now, what if the penult itself is short? If the penult is short, it will not want to take a circumflex accent. Circumflexes stand only over long vowels. So if an accented penult is short, it will always take an acute accent. Here are some examples. Logos. Notice it is accented on the second to the last syllable. That's the penult. The penult here is spelt with an omicron, and therefore it's short. So this accented penult takes the acute accent. Regardless of whether the ultima now is long or short, that doesn't make any difference. If it's accented on the penult and that penult is short, the accent will always be acute. Now let's take a look at the final accent, or the final syllable, the ultima. When the ultima is accented, how will it be accented? Well, first of all, if the ultima is short, it will take an acute accent. And that accent that would normally be acute will change to a grave. In other words, an acute accent on the ultima will always change to a grave when this word is followed immediately by another word. Now, if there's a punctuation mark after it, it'll stay as acute. If it comes at the end of the sentence, it'll be acute. But if another word follows immediately, then that what normally would have been an acute accent will change to the grave accent. And you will only find the grave on the ultima. Here are some examples. Avtos, uranos, adelphos, ios, Christos, kalon. All of these are accented with an acute on the ultima. If they were followed immediately by another word without a punctuation mark, those acutes would all change to graves. Now, what about an ultima that is long? Long ultimas will usually take an acute accent, but sometimes you'll find them with circumflex accents. And for that, you'll have to wait until we talk about some of the different kinds of verbs that take circumflex accents on their ultimas, and also some nouns. But we'll save those rules for a little bit later. But here are some examples of words that are accented with an acute on the ultima. Yini, Greek word for woman. In English, our word gynecology comes from this Greek word. Gynecology is the medicine relating to women. Next word, anir. Anir means a man, similar to the word anthropos, but anir is used almost exclusively of male, not generically both men and women. Thirdly, kathos, which is a comparative type of word, means as, or just as, or even as. Kathos. And then the fourth word, here. Here means hand, and is the word from which we get the English chiropractor. A chiropractor is somebody who practices with his hands, and it comes from this Greek word. These all have acute accents on those long ultimas. We also find a few examples of circumflex accents on ultimas. And here's what that looks like. Eavtu, ye, and imis. These all have circumflexes on those long ultimas. So again, a short ultima will always take an acute, which will change to a grave when followed by another word. If the ultima is long, it could be acute, but it might also be circumflex. And those are our rules for accents. Now we'll throw in some other rules as we go on and learn about some of the other nouns and verbs later in this class. But these are some of the general rules pertaining to accents and will help you with most of the accents at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit more about the grave accent. An acute, as we said, on an ultima will change to a grave when that word is followed by another word without intervening punctuation. So here are two words, adelphos and ion. Adelphos means man, ion means son, but notice when it's used in a sentence, look at these four words, adelphos, velepi, ion, avtu. In this sentence, both the words adelphos and ion are followed by another word, and so their acute accents changed to a grave. Adelphos, velepi, ion, avtu. A brother sees his son, would be how that would be translated, something like that. Here we're looking then at these grave accents. Notice the grave accents are falling when going from left to right. The acute accent rises from left to right. Now, let's talk about punctuation marks. Here I have an excerpt from Romans chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. And you can see it's written out in Greek. We start with a capital letter delta. We have a number of examples of both accent marks and breath marks. Notice in that first word you have a grave accent because the word dio is followed immediately by another word. Dio would normally be accented with an acute accent there. But used in a sentence and followed by another word, that acute changes to grave. The next word, anapologitos. Anapologitos is accented with an acute on the antipinult. Antipinult. Since you have a short ultima, it can be accented there. The third word, epsilon iota, just a very short word, only one syllable long, has both a smooth breathing and, notice, a circumflex accent on that long syllable. It's a digraph. All digraphs are considered long, and so it wants to take that circumflex accent. But now, notice right after the word E, you have a punctuation mark. It is a comma. Go to the end of that first line, and just before the last word on that first line, you find the word krinon, kappa, rho, iota, ni, omega, ni. And right after the word krinon, you find a raised dot. What is that? That's a punctuation mark. What punctuation mark is it, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you about the Greek punctuation marks. There are four of them. One is the comma, and we saw a comma in the middle of that first line, and the comma in Greek is just like the comma in English, no difference, used for the same reasons. The second is the period. The period in Greek is just like the period in English. It's a period, it's a dot resting on the line at the end of a sentence. The third is the semicolon. Now we have a semicolon in English, but it's a combination between a raised dot and a comma, in Greek the semicolon is just a raised dot. And that's what we're seeing in Romans 2, verse 1, almost to the end of the first line there. Right after the word krinon, that raised dot is a semicolon. It's not as full a stop as a period. It's a little bit more of a stop than a comma. Usually a semicolon will separate two clauses, where you have both a subject and a verb before and after the semicolon. Semicolon is a raised dot above the line. And then one more punctuation mark, the question mark. Now you'll notice the question mark in Greek looks like the English semicolon. Don't let that fool you. Remember that the Greek semicolon is just a single raised dot. What looks to us like a semicolon in Greek is a question mark. And if you look down at the very end of our citation from Romans 2, verses 1 through 3, right at the end of verse 3, you have a question mark. And this is asking the question, will you flee from the judgment of God? So that question mark is noted, that question is noted by the presence of a question mark. So here are our four punctuation marks in Greek: the comma, the period, the semicolon, the question mark. The comma and the period, no problem, just like in Greek. But the semicolon and the question mark you'll have to get used to. They're a little bit different in Greek than they are in English. Now, one final point about diacritics and punctuation. I want to talk about the apostrophe. We have apostrophes in English, and Greek uses apostrophes too. Usually an apostrophe is used both in Greek and in English to indicate that a letter has been dropped out, and the apostrophe shows where that initial letter would have been. We use it in English usually in contractions, like if we said didn't to replace did not, the O drops out of not, and we replace it with an apostrophe. So Greek has an apostrophe also. It often occurs at the end of a word in Greek to indicate the final vowel has been deleted. This is a feature known as elision. We say that that final vowel has elided. A vowel can elide, and that feature is called elision, and it will be noted by the presence of an apostrophe. This occurs when the next word also begins with a vowel in order to avoid two vowel sounds coming together. Now review with me what we talked about in the very first video about the alphabet. We have two kinds of letters in Greek. We have consonants, vowels. The feature of a vowel is that it allows the full escape of breath originating from your lungs, flowing up through the throat and out through the oral cavity. In order to move from one vowel sound to another vowel sound, you almost have to stop the breath and reform the mouth to form the next vowel sound. Usually that's done in words by inserting some consonant in between the two vowel sounds. Most of the words we pronounce have a stoppage or limitation of breath between two vowel sounds. Sometimes that is represented in writing by a written consonant. Other times the stoppage is heard, but we don't actually have a letter to express it. But it's very difficult to move from one vowel sound to another vowel sound without some means of making that transition. So in Greek, when one word ends in a vowel and the next word begins with a vowel, oftentimes the final vowel of that first word will drop out, and the fact that the vowel has dropped out will be represented by the presence of an apostrophe. Here's an example. Notice these two words, alpha, lambda, lambda, and then here's an apostrophe. Notice, by the way, that the apostrophe looks just like the smooth breathing mark. They look exactly the same, except that the apostrophe is not written over a letter. So alpha, lambda, lambda, pronounced al. The next word is epsilon, gamma, omega, pronounced eyo. Now the apostrophe at the end of al tells us that a vowel has dropped out. What vowel is it? Well, it was originally the vowel alpha. In order to transition from the sound of alpha, ah, to the sound of epsilon, eh, there needs to be some stoppage of breath. Now you could say Allah, ego. In order to say it that way, you have to pronounce some kind of a stoppage of breath which takes place down in your throat. And that is actually referred to as a glottal stop. But in Greek, what will happen is that alpha will simply drop out, replaced with an apostrophe, and it's pronounced together as one word, allego, allego. So instead of Allah ego, you have allego. It's easier to pronounce, and Greek in printed texts will represent that elided alpha by the presence of an apostrophe. So there is our epsilon, our vowel in the second word. Here's the alpha in the first word. It is that alpha that has elided and is replaced with this apostrophe. So you'll find that oftentimes. You might find it a little confusing at first because you don't have the alpha there. It's difficult to recognize what the word was. But in time, as you learn enough vocabulary in Greek, you'll know your vocabulary well enough to recognize that this word, alpha, lambda, lambda, apostrophe, was originally alpha, lambda, lambda, alpha. Now, when the next word has a rough breathing mark, the remaining consonant before the apostrophe may become aspirated. Let me tell you what we mean by that. Take a look at this example. The word meta, mi, epsilon, taf, alpha, ends in alpha. So when it comes before another word starting with a vowel, that alpha on the end of meta will elide and be replaced with an apostrophe. So this gives us methymon, mi, epsilon, thi, apostrophe, eta, mi, omega, ni, methymon. Now, since emon starts with a vowel, the alpha elides, but notice the emon has a rough breathing. And the rule here is that when the next word has a rough breath mark, then the remaining consonant in the first word will become aspirated. What do we mean by aspirated? Aspirated means it has breath mixed with it. So the taf in meta gets aspirated. What's an aspirated taf? Well, it's a dental stop. T, t. Now mix breath with the t sound and it comes out as th, th, like an English th. So methymon is what we have for metemon, which was originally metaemon. So it's this alpha then that has elided, become an apostrophe. The taf at the end of meta has been aspirated because of the